Vladimir Putin's empire, it's not simply crumbling tomorrow or in the distant future. It's cracking and breaking apart right now. Russian troops are being incinerated in the trenches of Ukraine. They can't hold their positions. Ukrainian drones simultaneously are turning Moscow's invincible air bases into smoldering scrap metal. And in the shadows of all this, there's something else going on. It gets far less press attention, but it's really interesting and worth taking note of. There's a lot of ordinary Russians who are striking back, and we see it almost every day in the Russian telegram channels. They're setting fire to railways, they're sabotaging infrastructure, and in many cases, it appears that they're plotting open revolt. That's pretty incredible. When your country gets into this sort of a situation, there's no clear exit. There's no way to just negotiate a peace. You just watch as the regime starts to collapse. It's fighting wars on all fronts, abroad, on its own borders, trying to protect its own assets within the country, and then against its own population, with whom it doesn't even know whom it could trust. Just think about this. In 1 month, Ukrainian drones were able to obliterate within Russia the very bombers that are used to terrorize the Ukrainian civilian population. Ukraine successfully shredded Russia's most advanced stealth fighters, which were parked inside of Russia. They forced the Kremlin to essentially admit that no airbase is any longer safe. And so while the state propaganda, TV stations, talk about how there's total control and a 3 day special military operation is just going splendidly, everybody sees the news. Those explosions are erupting across Russia. It sort of proves that this entire myth of Kremlin supremacy is dying. Everybody sees it. Unlike the Soviet Union, where it's easier to control the population due to the lack of electronic methods of communication, today, everybody has Telegram. People have access to the internet. It's censored, but news gets through. And ultimately, it's not going to be the rank and file person in Russia that matters, that creates political change, the ones that live out in Siberia. It's going to be the people in Moscow, the ones in St. Petersburg. And they're exactly the ones that have the access to technology and resources. So that's why there's ultimately something going on that's deeper. That's something that, even if there's 1,000 propagandists from Moscow, they cannot control, which is the very many millions of Russians who no longer believe that the war is worth dying for. We see this through the arson, we see this through the cross border attacks with Ukrainian weapons that they engage in. We see this in the fact that the Russian soldiers very commonly, just look at the videos on Telegram, leave out their equipment, such as their armed personnel carriers or their tanks, parked in an area that's easily attacked. Well, they should park it underneath trees to avoid the drones. Why don't they? Because they don't mind if it gets destroyed as long as they're not in it. They'd prefer to see it get destroyed, which means they get to go back home, than to stick around. There seems to be more and more people who realize that Putin is the enemy of Russia itself. So today, let's take a look at that. How Ukraine's drone war is destroying the Russian arsenal, and how Putin's grip, as a result, is slipping away, even in his own heartland, even in his own capital. Putin is truly cornered. His war is unraveling, and his time is quickly running out. My name is Jason Smart. I'm a special correspondent for the Kiev Post. And for over 20 years, I've studied the Putin regime and actively worked against it. I have worked against other authoritarian regimes. And what's happening inside of Russia today is absolutely incredible. The Russian news, which I watched this morning, is becoming more and more frantic. It's becoming more and more afraid. Just you can sense it. They don't understand how everything is going so badly for them. They look to show successes, and it's a joke. They have nothing to show. They're just desperate. But that sign of desperation is a very good sign. Because at this point, being lost and confused will only make things worse for them. Nothing will get better. So please, if you would, like this video, subscribe to the channel, consider becoming a member. The objective of this channel is only one thing: to expose the truth about the Putin regime and the other authoritarian regimes that work together against Ukraine. We're here to support Ukraine. So let's look at exactly what's going on. So we see that the Ukrainian forces have been very successful at maintaining their lines. They have ceded some territory, which we've discussed before, is part of the plan. They don't want to fight a war of attrition. They want to fight a war inside of Russia, which they're doing successfully. And that's why June 2025, this past month, was such a big deal. As you recall, the month started off great, hit 5 different air bases throughout Russia, destroyed a ton of different bombers and fighters. And the ones that they struck it wasn't just a joke, it wasn't just symbolic. By the end of June, just in the course of 30 days, Ukraine had successfully destroyed or seriously damaged about 30% of all of Russia's operational Tu-95s, about 14% of all of Russia's operational Su-57s, the stealth fighters, about 5% of all the Su-34s were destroyed or damaged. Russia has had to relocate its aviation across the country because it doesn't know where next a Ukrainian attack might come from. And what's going to make that even worse for Russia was the attack just in the past 48 hours on the Kupal electromechanical plant. That plant, the sole producer of the Tor M2 air defense. Russia has lost the ability to create more air defense. Just think about that, how serious that is. Russia means it can no longer not only protect its soldiers, it can't help its friends like Iran, which requested more air defense. It can't protect its own military bases. And ironically enough, it can't protect the plant that produces air defense. So the population as a whole is watching this. They're seeing that Ukrainian drones fly hundreds or even thousands of kilometers into the country and attack. And it can happen at any time. And the civilian population experiences that, not only because they see the explosions, not because every single day it is on Russian Telegram, and you can hear the people screaming, going nuts. They're totally shocked by it. They don't know what to do. They don't know how this is possible. It's happening within their own country. Just imagine this. Russian airports in the first half of this year, over 250 times have had to close due to Ukrainian drones. That means that Russia does not have control of the airspace above Russia, let alone over Ukraine. So at this point, what we see Ukraine doing is a systematic effort to destroy Russia's capacity to wage modern war. And it's doing it. It's humiliating the Kremlin on its own soil. But at the same time, there's something else going on. There's the Russians who are turning against the regime. So, as I've argued for many years, I don't expect a red revolution in Russia where all the people come to the streets and rise up for democracy. It'll probably go a different way. It'll come through things such as an oligarch deciding to seize power, or a Prigozhin Wagner group sort of this situation, where he very well could have taken power had he only gone to Moscow. But there's another way. When there's rebellion within the military and people turn against the power, send them off to die. So to understand this, we have to understand that Russia is ethnically a very diverse country. Though its propaganda always shows the white Orthodox people, it's got 190 ethnic groups, 20% of which are Muslims. That's a lot of people. And what's really interesting about that is they're exactly the ones that Vladimir Putin likes to send off to die. They're the ones that are dying in incredibly high rates. So Buryatia, which is actually, they're not Muslim, they are Buddhist, they die at a rate that's about 7 times higher than the rest of the population. Dagestan dies at a rate that's about 6 times the population. They are Muslim. And the population isn't very happy about that. They don't like being sent off to die. They don't like that their sons and husbands and fathers are needlessly being sent in. And the Russian officers don't treat them well. They treat them as simply cannon fodder. And that's why we've seen protests. So in Dagestan, interesting enough, it was the women who came out to protest, who were in physical altercations with the police, demanding that their sons or husbands come home. And this wasn't just a one-off. It's now happened multiple times. The people there are starting to cause problems. And where that gets really interesting is Russia now has had to send more soldiers there to make sure there's no insurrections on the local level. And you might ask yourself, why is it that Russia sends them off to die like this? Because Russia is ultimately in the business of colonies. And colonial powers typically send off colonial troops first. They have the Foreign Legion, which has the foreigners, or the ones who are technically a citizen, but they're the other. They're not really one of ours, who can afford to send off to die, because back in the capital, nobody's going to notice that they're missing. And that sort of proves why this whole idea of the one Russian people is just hollow. It's nonsense. Or that they're interested in helping the Russian speaking people of Ukraine. They don't care about the Russian speaking people in Russia. Why would they do that? But I digress. Within Ukraine itself, the Ukrainian military has several different legions composed of Russians from Russia who have come to fight for Ukraine. There's a Chechen unit, there's a Freedom of Russia Legion, there's a Russian Volunteer Corps, there's a Siberian battalion, and these are all just defectors from Russia who have come to help the Ukrainians defeat Russia because they want to see a Putin-free Russia. And they played a very important role, actually, in the occupation of Kursk and Belgorod, Russia since 2023, because there was a strategy to that. Ukraine, very correctly, decided that it should send a lot of them to occupy Russia. Because if it's Russians occupying Russia, well, that's no longer an occupation. That's a civil war breaking out in your country. And that's where it gets interesting. So within the population, there's a panic. And the news media did everything it could to avoid talking about the fact that it's Russians that were engaging in occupying parts of their country. Thousands of civilians were forced to evacuate because it's in fact Russian citizens so opposed to Putin, they've come to fight for the country's liberty from Putin. So it's not just Ukrainian propaganda. I've spoken to these people before. Russia had not anticipated this. In fact, back in 2022, Alexander Dugin, who's the chief ideologist, or is considered to be the closest ideologist to Putin, his daughter was blown up by a group called the NRA, National Republican Army of Russia. And that group consists of a lot of different people, but it apparently also consists of people from the FSB, the Russian intelligence service, who are opposed to the government of Russia. They want to see its overthrow. We've seen the hacking done in Russia. It's been done by a lot of people who seem to be tied to the FSB. It's not very good for Putin. Once again, traitors in his ranks, the fifth column, is a very dangerous thing. They might not do it for the Ukraine. They're doing because they want a better Russia. They don't want to go die in a war needlessly. And at the local level, we also see this. It's not just the FSB. There's been over 100 incidences of arson, derailment, targeting specifically the military logistics of Russia. The railways are getting hit all the time. Each time there's an attack, it ties up resources, it delays supplies arriving, and Russia doesn't seem to be able to stop it. It just continues and continues. And Putin ultimately is in a very weak spot because all dictators eventually have their last day. And at this stage, it seems the drone attacks that Ukraine are carrying out are having a very large secondary effect, of which you hear very little, but which we see more and more evidence of. The Russian people have had enough. They're becoming very worried about the future of their country. And as I said, I don't believe this would lead to a democratic change. However, what could very realistically happen, and it could happen very soon, is somebody else, be it a military officer, intelligence officer, a coalition of them, but undoubtedly with oligarchs who realize without Putin, our lives would be better off. Because right now, Putin is very weak, and everybody sees it. Everybody knows it. The Putin regime is headed towards collapse. Have no doubt about it. Thank you for listening today. I appreciate your time. Please like the video. Please subscribe. And as always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.